My book, Mother of Orphans, The True and Curious Story of Irish Alice, a colored man's widow, is about primarily my mother's family and a terrible decision that she had to make back in 1913. Um, but it does go into Irish Alice's background, which is Irish, and she was Irish American. But I found them in the census, her family, the Donlan family, in the census in this country in 1840. So, that's sort of, we think about the potato famine as being like one event, but apparently there were several along the way and other incursions by the British on their sovereignty and independence, including like a land scandal. And I think that her family came to the United States, well, prior to 1840 in one of the land deed transfers. That's a nice word for it, when they stole the land from the Irish people. So that's my mother's side, the white side. And then the black side were the Johnsons. And I'm not sure where they're from in Africa. What I do know is that after the Civil War, um, one person went back. So that would be my grandma's great grandfather. He got on one of the boats to Liberia. He was just tired of this country. So I can't really trace the black people how they came to the country, but I know one that left the country. Um, and those were the Johnsons. So so we've been like a biracial family for a very long time. My great grandparents, my book starts with their story. They were married in 1899 in Cincinnati, and which was quite unusual. They had a marriage license and everything, and it's a little hard for people to believe sometimes that black and white people were married then, but um, that time and after the Civil War was very much like now, where people were trying to roll things back. And biracial marriage was legal across the country, but after the Civil War, well, maybe I shouldn't say legal. In some places there were no laws, and in Ohio there was a law saying that you could marry. Um, but after the Civil War, they just tried to roll those things back. And some states did roll the law back to make it black and white marriage illegal, and other states, like Ohio, did not. Well, all those people, were working class people, except for um, rich people, um, the industrial class. Those were the rich people at the time. So both of them were, the women were domestics, Irish. Noel Ignatieff, How the Irish Became White, is his book. He's very detailed about how the Irish were able to raise themselves up in this country. And part of it was the women were maids. There were so many who were maids. It was such a prevalent occupation that maids were called Bridgets because that was common Irish name. So it's a sort of a slur, but it's sort of like, cliches. It's like the reason why people say it all the time is because it's true. And then what those women did was study and observe how the people they worked for lived. And that's where lace curtain Irish, where that phrase comes from, because the people they worked for had these fine things and they aspired to that. On the black side, John Johnson, Alice's husband, he was born in Kentucky and around the Lexington area. His father went there from Maryland, the Baltimore area, where he was enslaved, maybe. His army papers said he was not. He told the Army he was not. But there was a reason for that, in that there was a law in this country that any man who owed unrequited labor, that's the way they put it, basically an enslaved person, if it was found that he was in the Army and they could trace the owner got $300. So a lot of black men said they were not, because that idea that them being able to leave slavery and go into the Army would result in yet another payment to their owner, they couldn't abide that. So they said they were not. So at any rate, that was Isaac Johnson, and he, after he was a skilled tradesman, he was a mason. So the unit that he joined went through Kentucky, and Kentucky had gotten decimated from the war because John Hunt Morgan, a Confederate general, his strategy was to enter the Union via the Ohio River. So he was trying to cross the river at Kentucky. So they had a lot of battles there. So there was a lot of destruction in the structures. So Isaac saw that there was work in Kentucky. So after the war, when people were leaving, he was coming in. And all of his 13 children were born in Kentucky because he found work all around the Lexington vicinity. And my grandmother's father was born there. Okay, so now we're in Kentucky, and Kentucky is known for horses. And that's how he made his living, even though his father wanted him to be a mason. He had building skills, but his heart was with horses. And so that was the work that he did. So Alice and John met at the same house. They both worked at the same house. She was a maid, and he was the horseman, because horses were, of course, the Cadillacs of the era. And that's how they met. So John and Alice married in 1899 in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they had 3 children. And so John did do this work of, he was a gambler. He had fighting dogs. He bet on horses. He took care of horses. He also did some construction work. Mostly he was a contractor. He put people together on building projects, and his wife kept his books. But he had a heart condition, what we would call congestive heart failure. And he died of that in 1912, the same year that the Titanic sank. So the next year, she put their children in what is called what we call an orphanage, but it really wasn't. And it was something called a children's home, and it was where parents mostly mothers, who could not support their children, could put their children so that they would be cared for. They'd have a roof over their head, supervision, food to eat, and they went to school. She put them in this children's home, and she was able to maintain her relationship with them, which was different, And Ohio was one of the places that had one of the states that had each one of these kinds of homes in every county. Pennsylvania also had them. Michigan had a few of them. The big orphanage state was New York, and those were set up by the church for the Irish. So we didn't know very much about this story. All we knew was that all my mother knew was that her mother had been put in an orphanage by her mother. And you can imagine how that sounds. It sounds like she was a bad mother, and that she didn't want to raise her black children after her husband died. But that wasn't the case at all. There were many women who could not afford, they were too poor to raise these young kids, even with a job. And so that's why she put them in the orphanage. I went in search of that story because it did not make sense that they would be in an orphanage just on the face of it. because orphans don't have parents. But at the end of her life, it became the end of her life, Irish Alice came and lived with her daughter, my grandmother, in Detroit. So she was sitting right there among us. So, well, how does that work? That, her mother is sitting right here. So there was a lot that wasn't explained, a lot that people didn't know, because, in that time, life was hard for most people. And they just didn't speak about the trials and tribulations that they had, their troubles. They just tried to make the best of the day that they were in. So basically nobody knew the story, had no real explanation for the story, except that she was a bad mother. My mother attempted to make sense of it, and then so in the 60s, when she was telling us this story, when her grandmother died, Irish Alice, she said it was because racism. She said it was because she had Black children. She couldn't get a job if she kept them, at home with her, if it was known. And so, the 60s was a time like Black Lives Matter today, but more violent. And so it made sense. It made sense. And it just, but after a while it didn't. So I went and looked to try to see how did that work.